But I guess at this stage, like Chad mentioned, it's time to get to the actual data itself. I know that's what you're all here for. Of course, some of you may have been here to hear my rendition of Mariah Carey's My All. Just kidding, Mariah might no. Anyway, the key findings from the 2022 Pacific module. First of all, we have data for about 16 countries, we have data for 16 countries across the Pacific. These countries are listed here in alphabetical order: American Samoa, Australia, the Cook Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, Maui Nui or French Polynesia, Kiribati, New Caledonia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and of course Vanuatu. Now this year we received a total of 272 responses from people across the Pacific, whereby we not only asked respondents to respond to a series of survey questions like Chad intimated around the 5 areas identified, we also allowed respondents the option to provide more detail to help contextualize their responses. Now these open-ended boxes allowed respondents to develop and provide additional detail on the themes, which have been published as qualitative data summaries that are also available for you to view on the Rights Tracker. Now, in general, the data we collected regarding the Pacific module shows a very similar pattern to responses that were delivered in last year's iteration of the survey. This is where I'd like Chad to chime in from time to time. In particular, when it came to giving responses regarding the way the climate crisis was impacting human rights in the Pacific, responses from respondents across many of our countries suggested that it was worsening the ability for our people to enjoy their human rights. Some of the ways respondents told us that the climate crisis was impacting our people related to food security, also impacting the quality of water many people had access to, also the fact that the climate crisis was leading to coastal communities experiencing pressure on housing and shelter, which then can also lead to greater tension in households in other contexts, generating the potential of violence in certain instances. Thus, our respondents were really talking about how this was having a multiplier and cross-cutting effect on people's health, well-being, and even education. In fact, many respondents that also highlighted a greater concern around population displacement as a direct result of the climate crisis. Chad, did you want to chime in here?
Not with a ton of information, just that these are really common themes across countries. A couple of other things that we don't have listed here that have really been exemplified in the data for me is that several countries mention the rising level of various kinds of disease that either we thought were eradicated or we haven't really experienced in this part of the world that are now appearing around, as well as with the concerns around displacement, the rising risk and rising concerns around violence that come with that as resources are more constrained and as people have fewer access to those resources.
Thanks for that, Chad. Yes, absolutely. And in terms of rights to Indigenous sovereignty, it was clear that respondents were very familiar with and working with in many contexts where they stated the impacts of colonization was ongoing in places and in various guises, thus potentially undermining Indigenous sovereignty in their experiences. Certain respondents also mentioned that one way that Indigenous sovereignty comes under pressure is that increasing dependence on foreign aid and outside investors in the region. Was there anything else you wanted to mention here, Chad?
Nothing particular. Once again, it's more, that these themes also are largely exemplified in countries, that are still not only struggling with Indigenous sovereignty, but are struggling with their own sovereignty in light of other colonial powers that still exert a lot of force throughout the region, and that's something that respondents bring up pretty regularly.
Yes, and I think most of us here can understand that context and will have an idea of which locations in the Pacific that applies to, more pertinently. And of course, connected to this is the Indigenous land rights questions. And again, respondents, much like in our previous iterations of the survey, spoke about, again, the impacts of colonization being ongoing and how that sort of materializes, as namely in legacies of colonialism, undermining traditional land systems and places, and which can also sit in conflict with introduced land tenure systems as a consequence of this legacy. Some participants or respondents also mentioned land grabbing being an issue, and also highlighted the issue of gendered patterns around land rights, which were also mentioned by quite a few respondents in different contexts.
One thing I would add. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, one thing I would add there is another concept that we see arising in the data is the degree to which the law is sometimes only sort of a paper defense against those that would sort of engage in land grabbing efforts, right? That while many countries in the region have constitutional rights or legal rights that ensure indigenous access to land and maintenance of land, that oftentimes loopholes are found and other actions are allowed to take place for economic benefit that undermine those very laws. And so that, in general, law isn't enough. The enforcement has to be there as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Chad. And I guess in relation to cultural rights, of course, we understand all of these issues being closely aligned, if not interwoven. As with cultural rights, many respondents understood language, right, as being a key cultural right, or access to one's language and the health of one's language. And in many places around the region, a lot of our respondents said that our languages are still widely practiced. However, noted that there is a strong dominance of English and even French in certain spaces, which can impact the status of Indigenous languages in local contexts. So that was all I wanted to share in relation to the data, which again sort of mirrors what we've been seeing in the past two iterations of the survey, Chad.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So I guess we want to turn now to this interesting presentation of data that's here around the freedom from violence scores. I think I'd like you probably, Chad, to go over this and explain how this can be read on the rights tracker, oh my goodness, and the comparative aspect and the way that these data are presented here.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think it's really important to talk about that for just a moment. So these are graphs that are coming directly out of a rights tracker. You can go there right now, and if you go to the rights section at the top and click on any one of these 4 categories of violence, you can see these graphs there, and we'll walk through some of this a little bit later in the next session. But a couple of things that I wanted to note here. One, you'll note that each score isn't just a single score, it's a score with a bar around it. That bar represents our uncertainty about that score. So wider bars represent scores about which we are less certain. Smaller bars represent scores around which we are more certain. If 2 bars overlap with one another, we at HRMI would probably be unlikely or unwilling to say that those 2 scores are different, because we can't really say that with any certainty. The kinds of things that would make a bar wider are multiple, but largely it boils down to one of 2 factors most of the time. It's either that we didn't have a large number of respondents for that country, which tends to expand the level of uncertainty we have in that score, or it's because the respondents for that country told us very different things from one another, which also would obviously increase our uncertainty over what that score is. Now, one thing I want to make clear is, because the freedom from violence data that we collect are limited only to those countries in our Pacific module, you shouldn't read this as an absolute scale. If a country has a really low score on this, and is near the bottom of the scale, that doesn't necessarily mean it would be near the bottom of the scale if compared to every other country in the world. It simply means it's near the bottom of the scale when compared to the other countries that are included in our Pacific data. The same is true for countries with very high scores. A very high score doesn't necessarily mean that country is doing the best it could possibly do at that, or that it's even doing better than most of the countries in the world. It simply means that it's doing better than the other countries that are included in this phase of our data set right now. So in general, this probably is best read as comparative within the region and more comparative within the country, as each of these scores can be compared with one another within the country. So if a country is doing better or receives a better score on children's freedom from violence than it does on the freedom of violence for people with disabilities, then those comparisons can be made. You can say which areas are bigger difficulties for that country, which are less difficulties for that country. But I would encourage you really not to interpret it absolutely, because we just don't know yet. We haven't, this is data that we have for the Pacific, but we don't have for the rest of the world.
Thanks so much for that, Chad. Really interesting, the way that we present the data and how it can be read. I guess, my question for you then is, in relation to what we've seen in previous years, how does this compare in terms of freedom from violence for different groups?
In general, it's a story of consistency, which is, I would say one thing that I would point out that we actually didn't point out when I walked through the methodology earlier is that the Pacific largely outperforms most of the world on things like civil and political rights. The top of our scale is dominated by the Pacific. So, we can't really say how this compares to the rest of the world, but what we can say is that the problems that the Pacific has experienced in past years largely reflected in this year's data. We haven't seen anything that has led to huge sweeping changes across the areas that appear to be problems for countries and the areas that don't seem to be. That's not overly surprising, as we haven't seen broad sweeping changes in the political structure of the countries in the region, or broad sweeping changes in terms of the laws passed to engage with this. So, I think to the degree that there's a message here, I think it's a message of continued vigilance and continued work to try to improve these outcomes for our communities.
All right, thanks so much for that, Chad.